Here's a question I want to ask right at the start of our episode today, and I want you to kind of sit with it rather than immediately answer it. Think of a person or a type of person whose beliefs or behavior or choices you have strong opinions about. Someone whose theology you think is off. Maybe someone whose decisions you find troubling. Perhaps it's someone whose public presence in the Christian world concerns you. Now, how close are you to that person? Not geographically, I'm talking about relationally. Do you know their name? Have you spoken to them? Have you prayed with them? Have you eaten with them? Have you asked them about their life? Do they know yours? Because here's what I've noticed in Christian culture broadly, and sometimes in myself more than I like to admit, that the sharpest opinions are almost always held about people we have never met. Situations, we've observed from the outside, and communities we have watched from a distance. We have become extraordinarily fluent in critique these days, and extraordinarily reluctant to pay the cost of care. Well, welcome back to Radiant Hope. This is episode number 8 of The Quiet Sins No One Talks About. Today we're naming a sin that has really been given enormous institutional support by the internet. It's got cultural permission by our polarized moment in history here, and almost no examination in most church contexts. We just aren't paying attention to it. Well, today we're talking about judgment without relationship, when truth spoken from a distance is rarely love. Let's begin with the honest admission here. Critique is easier than care in almost every measurable way. Critique requires no proximity. You can form a detailed, confident, articulate opinion about a person, a ministry, a church, a theological position, without ever having been in the same room as the thing you're critiquing. The distance is not just acceptable, it often feels like an advantage. I can see more clearly because I'm not emotionally involved. Care, by contrast, requires you to show up, to be present in the thing, right? To let the other person's reality actually land on you. To be, in some sense, changed by the contact. Care is expensive. It costs time, it costs energy, it costs emotional exposure, and perhaps most significantly, it costs the clean confidence of the outside view. When you actually know someone, those crisp categories get complicated. The theological error you were certain about turns out to also live in a person who loves their children and prays in ways that convicts you. The behavior you were prepared to condemn turns out to have a history you didn't even know about. The community you were ready to write off turns out to be full of people who are simply trying, imperfectly, to follow Jesus in the circumstances that they have. So proximity complicates. And the sin of judgment without relationship is at its root a preference for the uncomplicated view, the clean verdict rendered from a safe altitude. Now, Thomas Watson identified the spiritual logic between this preference. He said, "It is easier to sit in judgment on a man's soul than to stoop and serve it. The judge's seat is elevated. The servant's basin is on the floor." There are many in the church who prefer the elevation, telling themselves it is discernment, when it is in truth a refusal to kneel. So the servant posture, basin in hand on the floor, is the posture of genuine care. Judgment, from a distance, chooses the bench instead. It could do so almost indefinitely because the person being judged is not present to complicate the picture. There's also something else happening behind the preference for critique over care, and it's worth making note of it here. Critique makes us feel right, and being right makes us feel safe. When I have identified your error clearly and stated it confidently, I have established a position of moral clarity. I know where I stand. I know where you stand. The verdict is in. Care, by contrast, is uncertain. When I enter into a relationship with a person whose life or theology troubles me, I cannot guarantee where it'll go. I may be changed. I may discover I was partly wrong. I might find that the categories I brought into the discussion here don't account for everything I find. I may be required to love someone I cannot fully approve of, which is, turns out, what love nearly always requires. John Calvin, commenting on the log and speck passage in Matthew 7, observed that the eager judge reveals his own unresolved condition. He said, "Who is most fierce in observing the faults of others is generally least acquainted with his own. The eye turns outward when it cannot bear to look inward. What it calls vigilance is often nothing more than the preferred direction of a gaze that fears its own reflection." Judgment from a distance is, in many cases, a form of avoidance, a way of keeping the moral spotlight on the other person so that it doesn't return to oneself. So what's the difference between biblical confrontation and commentary? Now, here is where I want to be careful, because the answer to judgment without relationship is not to pretend that the truth is subjective, that error doesn't matter, or that the church has no responsibility for accountability. The answer is not the abolition of discernment. The answer is what the New Testament actually calls for, which is something harder, more specific, and more relational than what we tend to practice. Matthew 18:15. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Notice what Jesus requires before any further action. It's a conversation between you and him alone. The very first step in biblical confrontations is not a post, not a platform, not a letter addressed to the broader community. It is a private conversation between the two people who have a relationship. This is so basic it almost seems obvious. And yet it describes something that is practiced extraordinarily rarely in the way Christians actually handle disagreement with one another today. Galatians 6:1 is even more specific about the posture. It says, "Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted." I want to unpack this verse carefully because it contains almost everything important about the difference between biblical confrontation and mere just commentary. He says, "You who are spiritual." Paul's not saying that only the elite, the senior, the theologically sophisticated should address sin. He's saying that addressing sin requires a spiritual posture, one that is dependent on the Spirit, rooted in prayer, not driven by flesh or competition or pride. The person qualified to confront sin is not primarily the person who is right. It is the person who is humble. Next he says, should restore him. So the goal here is restoration. Not exposure, not correction as an end in itself, not the satisfaction of having named something. It's restoration. The word implies that the confronting person wants the other person back, wants them whole, wants them close, wants them flourishing. Cannot restore someone you're not willing to be in relationship with. Paul says, in a spirit of gentleness. So the posture is not neutral, and it's not cynical, or clinical for that matter. It's gentle. Gentleness in the New Testament it's a strong word. It describes the kind of strength that has learned to hold back. The confrontation that comes in a spirit of gentleness is one that has already paid the cost of self-restraint. Paul next says, keep watch on yourself lest you too be tempted. So Paul lands the most uncomfortable requirement of the whole thing here. Before you go, look at yourself. The one doing the confronting is not above the fray. They're not the prosecutor. They are a fellow traveler who has stumbled, maybe less, at least in this particular way. At least so far, right? And who therefore has the responsibility to help here. Richard Baxter, who had extensive experience with both church discipline and pastoral restoration, wrote about this with the authority of someone who had done the hard things many times. He said, "He who confronts without first praying for the one he confronts has made the confrontation about himself. The man who has wept for his brother's soul before he addresses his brother's sin will speak in a different tone with a different face. He will be received differently. For the other man can tell the difference between someone who wants to correct him and someone who wants to restore him." That distinction is felt in the room, in the tone, in what's underneath the words. And it can't be faked because it comes from a different place, from actual love for the person, not love for being right. Now let me name what I am calling commentary, right? As distinct from biblical confrontation. Commentary is when we address a person's sin or error to an audience other than the actual person. Well, they might be in the audience, but there's an audience. When the conversation about the problem does not include the person at the center of it, when they're not, maybe they're not included, maybe they stumble upon it. Who knows if they even see it? That's not the point. So there's a tone of evaluation rather than restoration. The commentary is when the goal, if we're honest, is to establish the commentator's position more than to help the person being discussed. It's try to, like you're pointing out someone else's problem so you can make your case. So commentary can be done with theological precision. It can quote scripture. It can be calm, measured, well-sourced. And it can still be sin because its structure violates the one Jesus actually described. Go to him, not go about him. Not go to the internet about him. Not gather others to assess him. Go to him. Jonathan Edwards, in his careful treatment of Genesis, or the genuine versus counterfeit charity, described what he called the test of the motive. Here's what he said. He said, "The true test of whether our concern for another's error is love or judgment is simple. Are we willing to be inconvenienced by them? Are we willing to enter into their confusion and their mess and to stay there until something changes? The answer is no. If what we want is to register our assessment and be done, then what we have offered is not love, whatever name we've given it." So willing to be inconvenienced by them, that's the thing he's pointing out here. Willing to stay there, willing to remain present through the confusion and the mess. That is the shape of love, really, in a fallen world. And it is extraordinarily more demanding than just giving some running commentary about people's problems. Now let me make this concrete, because I think the gap between the biblical model and our actual practice is really wide enough that we need to think carefully about what it would look like, to close that gap. Now, proximity means that the person I am most concerned about is someone I'm actually moving toward. Not to surveil them, not to stalk them, not to build a case, but to actually know them. Confrontation that is rooted in relationship has a different texture entirely from the confrontation that is rooted in observation. The person who has sat with you, eaten with you, known your history, and when that person comes to you with concern, you receive it differently. At least you should. Because you know what it costs them to come to you. You know they are not your enemy. You know the conversation is happening because of care, not despite it. Proverbs 27:6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, profuse are the kisses of an enemy." The faithful wound, the hard word from someone who loves you, is one of the most valuable things a human being can receive. But it requires a friend, and friends require proximity. Patience means that the relational groundwork comes before the confrontation, not as its substitute, but as its essential precondition. The Puritans spoke extensively of what they called the discipline of long acquaintance, the kind of knowledge that comes only from sustained relationship over time. Our friend John Owen wrote, "You cannot truly know a man's error until you know the man. And knowing the man takes time. More time than we find comfortable. More patience than most of us willingly give. The man who judges quickly has not loved long." That is not a call to delay accountability indefinitely. It's It's a call to recognize that truth spoken without the relational context to receive it is seed on hard ground. It may be accurate, may be necessary. But if the ground hasn't been prepared, if trust hasn't been built, if love hasn't been demonstrated, the word will not penetrate. And we will have satisfied our sense of faithfulness without actually doing any good for the person. Risk is the dimension most consistently missing from distance judgment. And its absence is precisely what makes distance judgment so attractive to people. Commentary from a distance carries almost no personal risk. If the person doesn't respond well, the commentator just simply moves on. If the verdict is wrong, it can be revised, right? If the relationship is damaged, there was no relationship to begin with, so no big deal. But genuine love, by contrast, takes the risk of being wrong, being misunderstood, being rejected, being changed. The person who goes to their brother in private, as Jesus instructs, takes the risk that the brother will receive it badly. That relationship will be strained. That will look presumptuous or harsh. And take the risk that they themselves will be confronted in return. That's what you're going to do when you go. You might receive confrontation. You might be confronted in some of your sins. Charles Spurgeon, preaching on the nature of genuine love in the church, said, if you're not willing to be hurt by the person you're trying to help, you're not helping them. You're managing them from a safe distance. Love that carries no personal risk is not the love of Calvary. It is a more comfortable thing than that, and a less useful one. Boom, right? Love that carries no personal risk is not the love of Calvary. The cross is the ultimate act of relational proximity, right? God entering into the mess entirely, not managing it from above. And when we're called to love as Christ loved, the call is that same direction, toward, not away. We're in it, not just hovering above it. So I want to offer two practical anchors for this week for you. The first is a question to apply to your opinions. First, is there a person I hold strong views about whom I have never moved toward? Not views about an idea or theology in the abstract, but about a person, a specific human being made in the image of God, whose name I know and whose errors I could describe. And if the answer is yes, if my assessment of them is confident and my knowledge of them is thin, that is worth examining. It does not necessarily mean the assessment is wrong, but it may mean the assessment has been formed in conditions that do not yet qualify as love. The second is a discipline to practice here. Before you speak about someone, pray for them. Not once performatively, but, actually, by name, for their actual well-being, for their growth, for God's work in their life. You'll find, as Richard Baxter found, that the tone of everything that follows is altered because of this. Because you cannot pray genuinely for someone and maintain a purely prosecutor, I can't even talk, a horrible posture towards them. The prayer does something to the heart that the critique was never able to do. William Perkins wrote about what he called the grammar of love, the way that genuine care restructures everything about how truth is communicated. He said, let the man who would speak truth to another first ask, do I want this person to flourish? The answer is yes. It will show in every word, every pause, every willingness to be wrong. The answer is no, or not yet. He's not ready to speak, and the truth in his mouth will do the work of a weapon rather than a medicine. So the same words, coming from a different motive and a different posture, produce different outcomes. Truth is not self-delivering. It requires a messenger who has paid the cost of love. There is someone in your life, or on the edges of it, whom you have opinions about, and whom you have not moved toward. Not to win an argument, not to deliver a verdict, but just to know them, to be present with them, to be the kind of person whose love is demonstrated before, whose truth is spoken. That movement toward, not above, is one of the most countercultural, costly, and Christ-like things that you can do this week. Now, it's going to cost you something, but guess what? It's supposed to, right? It's supposed to cost you. So think about that. Well, until next time, walk humbly, think biblically, especially about this, and rest in the steady hope that God provides.